This lecture will be about newspapers and journalism. A newspaper is defined as a geographically limited medium issued regularly from a press on unbound paper. Newspapers contain news, commentary, features, photographs, and advertising. It serves the general interests of a specific community or audience. Geographically limited means it serves either a single community, a city, or a region, and an exception would be a metropolitan newspaper with a large distribution list that has people that read it plus subscribers from all over the world, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. Although readership is down in newspapers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, newspapers as a medium of news have diversity and depth because most newspapers have more in-depth news coverage than broadcast news. Large newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal or USA Today provide more international and national news, financial and business news, etc. Yet the depth of reporting is far deeper than what you'd see on television news, which may be a 30-second clip on something. Newspapers are broken down into several departments with administration in the center, as you see in the staff there. The editorial staff includes the editors and reporters, and the editor-in-chief is in charge of the publication. There's also section editors, copy editors, fact checkers, etc. Larger newspapers also include photographers and videographers, but smaller papers may require reporters to handle both the writing aspects and the multimedia. Reporters have beats, which would be similar to what you hear with a policeman has a beat. It's a specific area of interest that they cover. Sometimes they'll write about personal experiences. Advertising is a major income source because newspapers are a business. This department includes sales, copywriters, and graphic artists. The production department for a print newspaper includes graphic artists, desktop publishers, printers, press operators, etc. Online newspapers are produced by web designers and webmasters, and a small news publication may require its journalists to upload their own content as well as take on the initial editing. The circulation department works with retailers, distributors, and they also sell subscriptions. Circulation numbers attract advertisers who want to reach a target audience. Administration oversees all the departments, and they also include support staff such as accounting, marketing, human resources, and information technology. The newspaper industry today is in crisis. This isn't just in the United States, it's all over the world. Most readers today are over 40, and most coverage is strictly local. Newspapers depend on revenue from advertising sales and subscriptions to survive. With both continuously dropping, many papers have had to lay off staff and trim the amount of covered content, and many have moved online, yet without a successful strategy of how to keep the revenue stream flowing, the same as the revenue from the traditional print. People today are getting their news from other sources, especially from the internet. But for now, let's look back at the history of newspapers. Before we had newspapers in the United States, the ancient Romans had the Acta Diurna. This was launched by Julius Caesar. It was a daily handwritten gazette. It reported noteworthy events, private and official notices, etc., and it continued for about 350 years. Then in China, they had the Taipao, which provided news to government officials and the intellectually elite. About 1640, in England, appeared diurnals, and these were printed 4-page bulletins that only contained local news. The first regularly published newspapers started in England. In 1665, the Oxford Gazette, and in 1702, the Daily Courant, which was the first daily. The colonial press began before the Revolutionary War. News from Europe was prevalent in newspapers, but reported weeks or even months after the fact. Think about it. The only way to get it across the ocean was by boat. It also contained material copied from other newspapers as well as local gossip. However, newspapers were licensed by the British government, so criticism of the government was rare. Most print shops were run by one person, and the printer served as the editor. The first 3 newspapers published in Boston were Harris's Public Occurrences. It was banned by the government, because he was printing without a license and they didn't like his dangerous thoughts, which, for example, was a sex scandal involving the King of France. It was shut down after printing just one issue. The Boston Newsletter and the Gazette were both licensed and reflected the government restraint because they only published by authority on their front pages. In other words, they only published what was already previewed and approved, which is called prior restraint. Also in Boston, James Franklin was arrested for refusing to stop publishing his newspaper. He apologized to avoid further imprisonment, but to circumvent the law, he had his 16-year-old brother Benjamin take over. Yes, that's the Benjamin Franklin we all know. Benjamin started publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette in Philadelphia several years later, and about that point newspapers started popping up all over the colonies. The struggle for freedom of expression and being able to print without prior restraint was also the mission to allow truth as statements as a defense for libel. At this time, few of the colonists were literate, and most subscribers were only the elite, the rich, the powerful, and the educated. However, early newspapers had a high pass-on readership and high listenership, which meant they were read aloud in pubs, barbershops, etc. Leading up to the American Revolution, the content became more opinion-oriented about the disenchantment with British rule. Editors became bolder as dissatisfaction with British rule increased. Most publishers, however, were forced to choose sides between the Tories or the Patriots because impartiality wasn't tolerated. The press was used as propaganda by both sides, but what history remembers most are the heavy doses of persuasion and propaganda that were used to incite and gather support of independence by the Patriots. The American Crisis is a collection of articles written by Thomas Paine during the Revolutionary War. In 1776, Paine wrote Common Sense, an extremely popular and successful pamphlet arguing for independence from England. Samuel Adams was the voice of the Patriots. He had a deep understanding of the power of persuasion by using propaganda. He knew that so well that he wrote in a variety of publications, and he used 25 different pen names so that he wouldn't get caught and arrested. After the Revolutionary War, Federalists favored a strong federal government. Debate over adoption of a new constitution was divided between the Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton, who favored a strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists, such as Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, who wanted a weaker federal government and felt the colonies should be able to choose their own laws. Hamilton published the Federalist Papers, which were 85 essays written by himself, James Madison, and John Jay. They were printed throughout newspapers in the colonies, specifically to gain support of the ratification of the federal Constitution. A little bit more history here. During and after the Constitution was ratified, the Anti-Federalists and the state legislatures expressed concern that the new Constitution gave too much emphasis on the power of the federal government. They wanted a happy medium. So this was eventually the drafting and adoption of the Bill of Rights, which includes the First Amendment, which limits the power of the federal government. The first dailies appeared in 1783, but they were publications specific for each presidential administration and were their official mouthpiece. There was two definitive political parties at the time, the Federalists, which were similar to today's Republicans, and the Whigs, which were liberal or Democrats. Newspapers chose one side or the other, and they often paid a subsidy to act as the political mouthpiece. There was intense partisanship in columns to the extent of attacking and name-calling. The irony in that is they were doing exactly what their fellow editors and publishers fought for almost 100 years earlier to get away from the control of the British. At this time, there wasn't any mass medium because there was too many geographic and transportation issues and limitations. Messages couldn't travel any faster than people or horses could run or boats could sail. Benjamin Day launched The Sun in 1833 by selling advertising versus charging a high price for subscriptions that most people couldn't afford. He took the cost that was normally 5 to 6 cents and made it only a penny. Now think about it. This is a time period when there's people moving into the big cities and literacy increased. The penny paper meant the audience base broadened from the elite to a true mass medium because now it was affordable to the growing urban lower class. This new audience segment wanted more than news, so Day introduced the human interest format of sensationalism. He focused on the everyday life of a common man. He also introduced a new way of selling the London plan by using young boys from the lower class called newsboys or newsies. They'd stand on the street corners and hawk their newspapers. James Gordon Bennett launched the New York Tribune in 1835, and this was truly the birth of the modern newspaper. It had simple wording, it had reporters who were assigned specific beats, they were watchdogs of the government. He had foreign correspondents as well as correspondents in the nation's capital. This changed the format from analyzing ideas to reporting news. It established journalism as a discipline. Bennett sent out correspondents by pony express, boat, or train because he wanted them to get out there and scoop the competition. In 1841, Horace Greeley launched the New York Herald. This newspaper had national influence. He also created the editorial page and had specialized news. He was a crusader for unionism, abstinence, abolishment of capital punishment, and westward expansion. And his strong editorials helped shape public opinion. They changed society. Add in Henry Raymond, founder of the New York Times, who personally accompanied presidential candidates on campaign tours so he could get first-hand political news. At this time, too, the Associated Press was established in 1848, which added the creation of wire services and consistent news style. By this point, the telegraph had been invented, so you can imagine how the dissemination of news changed. No more dependence on the Pony Express. Also during this time period, there were a lot of specialized newspapers specific to social reform that were the mouthpieces for groups who didn't have full rights as citizens. Frederick Douglass published the North Star, which was to inform readers of the horrors of slavery. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton published The Revolution, which promoted women's right to vote. There were also newspapers printed for ethnic enclaves in native languages because this was the time of the Industrial Revolution and there was a large influx of immigrants, especially into the major port cities on the east. They also read the English language papers because it was a good way for them to learn English. So, in conclusion of the penny press, let's talk about the significance. It was the basis of economic support for newspapers. It set the pattern of newspaper distribution. It changed the definition of news, and it changed the techniques of news collection. During the Civil War, there was extensive news coverage, reporting, and illustration. War correspondents used the telegraph for late-breaking battlefield news, but there was speed in reporting the news because a lot of times the telegraph wires were cut, specifically so news wouldn't get anywhere. Illustrated news weeklies gained popularity, and wartime censorship was imposed, but it wasn't particularly effective. At this time, two other elements in journalism emerged, the inverted pyramid and objectivity. With the inverted pyramid, reports had to be sent timely because of the telegraph wires being cut. So they made sure that they published first the important news and then the lesser details came towards the bottom. They used short sentences and very short paragraphs. Now remember, during the Civil War, you had a country divided, so objectivity was very important because reporters couldn't pick a side. So they stuck with the basic who, what, why, where, when, and how. And today we call that the 5 W's and H format. Another thing that's significant to this time period was photographer Matthew Brady had convinced President Lincoln to allow him to document the war in photographs. But photos could only run in magazines because they hadn't at that time yet developed the technique to print them in newspapers. Yellow journalism was all about sensationalism. It was about crime, sex, scandals, and violence. Two people of mention are Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, and you can read about them here. It was the end of the 19th century, and newspapers were the nation's main source of information, but competition grew, which developed newspaper empires. Hearst was accused of starting the Spanish-American War because he claimed that the sinking of the battleship Maine, was the work of an enemy, and he offered a $50,000 reward for, quote, the detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. Think of how much money back then $50,000 was. Because of the competition between the two of these, between the New York World and the New York Journal, circulation in New York rose to as much as 1 million a day. During this time period, there was an explosion of feature and non-news content as well. There was comic strips, advice for the lovelorn, games and puzzles, things like that. Technologies were also developed for color printing and photo reproduction. In a nutshell, yellow journalism sold newspapers. It used content that appealed to the semi-educated masses in those growing urban populations who demanded a certain level of entertainment mixed in with their news. However, people became disenchanted with this type of reporting, and in the end, the New York Times, who didn't give in to the whole sensationalism, emerged as the leader. This is sort of a broad area, and I'm going to break these down a little further, but between World War I and the very beginnings or the early years of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of public affairs reporting, and the press had to respond to both world wars, the Depression, and also McCarthyism and his accusations that half the government was communist. Print journalism gave more in-depth reporting in it, because now it had to compete with radio and the early days of television. So after decades of sensationalism, objectivity became the ideal for reporters during this time. I'm going to go backwards a little bit here. We're going to go back to the Roaring '20s. There was a lust for sensationalism. This was a time period when life was all about being happy and partying and smoking cigarettes and drinking a lot of illegal booze. The New York Daily News was the first tabloid, which is a smaller size than the broadsheet newspaper, became #1 in the U.S. They loved to write about sex and celebrities and murder and scandal and just other staples of that age and that era. I'm going to give you a little narrative of an example of this time period that I find really interesting. At that time, there was a trial going on with a man named Kip Rhinelander, and he was a socialite, very rich, and he took his 3-month wife to court saying he wanted a divorce because she wasn't white, she was of mixed race, and at that time that was grounds for divorce. However, during the trial, the court required Alice to disrobe on the witness stand so they could look at her skin. And to really find out if she was white or not, the court wanted the jury to inspect the color of her nipples. Obviously, they couldn't get in there to take photographs, so they staged this picture. And this was all before Photoshop. The editor-in-chief, whose name was Emile Gavreau, hired an artist who used a model and then superimposed headshots of his reporters over the faces of the jury and the attorneys. As the world entered the Great Depression, readers demanded more objective and interpretive news reporting. But the big story didn't die out, but now it usually involved stories about crime and celebrities. In 1934, Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested. When he came to trial, there were 300 reporters who wired 11 million words in 28 days. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the next day the U.S. entered the war. It declared war on Japan, and then in another few days it declared war on Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. The U.S. involvement continued until Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945. At that time, newspapers moved back into breaking news, with several editions a day. There were more than 1,600 U.S. journalists in Europe covering breaking news after the U.S. entered the war. After World War II, Americans were frightened because the Russians took communist control over much of Eastern Europe, and the People's Republic of China was established. Americans were afraid this would spread to its lands, and soon there was a climate of fear and suspicion. Government agencies and private groups began to look for evidence of subversive activity, and the House Committee on Un-American Activities was established. In 1950, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, for political gain, began a smear campaign using bullying and innuendo to, quote, identify communists in the U.S. government, as well as some of the more liberals in Hollywood. The phrase McCarthyism was coined by political cartoonist Herbert Bloch. For 4 years, McCarthy's accusations became headline news, and the entire time, Bloch attacked McCarthy's heavy-handed tactics. McCarthy was eventually censored and condemned by the Senate. The media was responsible for the birth and the death of McCarthyism because the reporters were negligent during the early years of this, and they gave this man all this attention who should have been instantly exposed as a fake. After this happened, the press began fact-checking, and they started to ask more responsible questions before a story would be printed. McCarthy's propaganda techniques had forced newspapers and the wire services to re-examine their practices and to make greater use of interpretive reporting. When television appeared and became popular, newspapers now had to rethink their appeal to readers. Because TV could report highlights, but newspapers could explain and elaborate. In 1960 to about 1980, we saw the beginning of investigative journalism. The civil rights movement gained attention. There was a lot of opposition to the war in Vietnam, and the horrors of war and other unpopular stories were given a lot of coverage, a lot of front page coverage. We also had the leak of the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, and this brought a whole new era of investigative and adversarial journalism. Journalism became professionalized. Few journalists in America's history have had the impact on their era and their craft as Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. In the early 1970s, they broke the Watergate story for the Washington Post and set the standard for modern investigative reporting. The newspaper, as well as the journalists, were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for their effort. In 1982, the Gannett Corporation launched USA Today. It was the first time a newspaper was printed in color. It had non-controversial national news written in a simple writing style. It used a lot of color photographs and imagery. Also bullet-pointed factoids. Today it's still the second most widely circulated print newspaper in the U.S. And today we have computer age journalism, which is another whole lecture in itself. So I'm just going to make these points here that as computer technology changed and the internet became, I want to say household, this is long before Wi-Fi, it enhanced efficiency and news gathering abilities. Remember, now we had Google. Desktop publishing replaced typesetting, and there was an explosion of online versions of what used to be print-only newspapers. They used a lot less text, and they told their stories in pictures and videos. And convergence journalism was mashing it all up together and making a story using text, photos, and video. We'll talk more about this when we talk about mass media and the internet.